If everyone can find their seats, we're starting in 1 minute. Well, yes, everyone. I hope you all feel refreshed. It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our next guest, distinguished Professor Jean Comroff from Harvard University, Department of African and African American Studies and Department of Anthropology. Now, her research, primarily conducted in Southern Africa, has centered on processes of social and cultural transformation, the making and unmaking of colonial society, the nature of the post-colony, the late modern world viewed from the global south. And her writings has covered a range of topics from religion, medicine, and body politics to state formation, crime, democracy, and difference. And her latest book is titled The Truth About Crime, Sovereignty, Knowledge, and Social Order. Please welcome Jean Comroff.
Oh, my goodness, this is like the Inquisition. Very resonant with the topic I'm about to discuss. There's no way that we can... Okay, yeah. Is there any way? Just a slightly? Okay. Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to Thomas and to Irene and to everybody who's made this visit possible. It's delightful being back in the Literatuurhaus again. It's a wonderful place. This talk is taken from, indeed, a book called The Truth About Crime, but it was written together with John Comroff, who's actually here this evening, and if there are any nasty questions, I might call upon him to come and support me here. It deals with a topic that was virtually present in many of... Thank you. And that helps a little bit with the glare. Thank you. That was virtually present in many of the presentations, the fine presentations today. And maybe in contrast with the wonderful paper that we started off with, this concerns a global question that has grabbed the imagination, the popular imagination, and in many ways the popular politic in many parts of the world. And the question is why this family resemblance in so many places, and this is a way of trying to think about it. Once upon a time, Michel Foucault famously noted, public executions dramatize the deadly vengeance of the law, and with it the sublime power of the sovereign. But in the late 18th century, punishment as spectacle began to disappear in favor of a more immediately physical regime of discipline. A sober modern economy of suspended rights, administered in the name of civil authority. The starkness of this telos has been disputed, of course, and this relates right back to what we were talking about. For one thing, torture never went away. It merely became less open to scrutiny. For another, as the 20th century drew to a close, a new kind of punitive spectacle began to reveal itself, an ever more heated, expressive violence of law enforcement. And this was the case in many places. Think here of the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles, or the deployment of brute force against unruly youth in London, Paris, or Mexico, most recently Venezuela. Or think of the Maracana massacre in South Africa. All of these are instances of punishment without due process, sometimes capital punishment. Part of a growing culture of cruelty, this violence is often very public, theatrical, and effectively charged, underscoring the growing centrality of visible enforcement to statecraft in much of the world. Policing in the name of public order creates felons even before the fact, punishing them as such, even before their crimes are legally proven. Now, that this is the case is not all that surprising. Citizenship these days is framed less in terms of the social contract of liberty and the good life than with basic rights to safety and security, which is seen in many places to be imperiled on all sides by the irresponsible and the unemployed, by criminals or crimmigrants, as Katerina told us today, illegal immigrants, terrorists, bent businessmen, statespeople, police, and soldiers. 4 fragments drawn from public discourse, each distinctly diagnostic of its time and place, capture this zeitgeist. And I stress these are fragments taken from public discourse. It's not my voice or John's here. The first is from Britain in 2011. Prime Minister David Cameron cut short his summer vacation to chair a crisis meeting with government ministers as the streets of London continue to see rioting and looting, and as the prospect of further violence spread to other cities. He said that the government would do everything necessary to restore order and characterize the riots as pure criminality. 450 people had already been arrested and more would follow. The second is a journalistic report from the US in 2014. In the wake of the shooting of an unarmed black man, Michael Brown, by a white police officer, African Americans in Ferguson, Missouri, have caused serious complications for the US national security state. By virtue of standing their ground in their own small city, the demonstrators have forced the police to show their true colors, militarized colors. Ferguson's rebellious youth have pinned down the armed forces of repression so that the world can see the truth that the police are an army of occupation. Since America claims not to make war on its own citizens, the war against black people had to be called something else, the war on drugs or simply the war on crime, unquote. The third is a quote from South Africa from a website in 2011. This website is called Turn It Around South Africa. On it, you can receive regular reports of crimes happening near your home and business, and can also report suspicious activity to inform others. If your neighbor was hijacked or robbed, would you even know? High walls and security have made neighbors strangers to one another. With Turn It Around, you will be informed of crimes around you. We can use crime to bring us together and become one another's safety zones. You are not alone. Everyone feels the way you do about crime. The fourth is an ad from Britain in 2014. Capita PLC is the UK's leading private provider of integrated security solutions, with 64,000 staff across the UK, Europe, South Africa, and India. As the first providers of outsourced police custody services in the UK, we process 6,044 detainees for the UK Police and Home Service annually, enabling them to carry out their job efficiently and effectively. As these fragments make plain, crime is a major preoccupation across much of the world today. It always has been, more or less, since the dawn of modernity. Nor is this surprising. The modernist nation state, after all, was founded on a scaffolding of legalities. To the degree that it conceived of itself, in classic liberal terms, as a body of free citizens living under the rule of law, the nightmare was crime run amok, crime out of control. Emil Durkheim, reflecting this ideology, long ago noted the functionist corollary that follows from this. Crime became a critical prism through which society came to know itself, could measure itself against its own ideal self-image, could contemplate the ways and means of perfecting itself. As he put it, a society free of crime would fall into chaos, being bereft of the signs of its own existence as an authoritative order. It would lack the means to reflect on and to govern itself, hence the concern with breaches in the law. Still, the sense that lawlessness is presently on the rise, dangerously so, seems evident almost everywhere. As David Garland notes, high crime rates are now regarded as a normal social fact, a fact that elicits fascination as well as fear, anger, and resentment. Already in 2001, the director of Europol said publicly that crime, both domestic and transnational, had come to pose a critical threat to nation states. Governments, he added, ought to rethink the prevailing paradigm of international geopolitics, and I quote, "Resources previously being spent on military defense would be better invested in dealing with this crime threat." Many agreed. In Britain, the so-called rule of lawlessness has been a major issue for more than 2 decades, to the extent that at the millennium, the country was said to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Since then, felony rates have dropped sharply, but 2/3 of the population believe the contrary. Even in law-abiding Singapore, the state recently festooned the streets with signage that read, "Low crime doesn't mean no crime." By contrast, South Africa has much higher incidences of violent transgression. Murder and rape capital of the world is the claim, the bold-faced claim, made for it by its citizens. The boldness attests to an odd mixture of assertiveness and ignominy, the frisson that comes from living in a place taken to be a kind of perilous paradise. In fact, South Africa is not all that exceptional. True, whites suffer more attacks on personal and property than they did during apartheid, when they lived in garrisoned enclaves. As the racial state gave way, crime spilled over the boundaries of black neighborhoods where it had long been endemic. Nevertheless, beyond the poorest of black neighborhoods, risk to life and limb still lies less in lawlessness than in other more mundane things. Over the past decade or so, moreover, rates of most felonies have dropped substantially. Nor is South Africa the only crime capital of the world. That crown is claimed, among others, by Kingston, Caracas, Washington, D.C., even Baltimore. What is striking, though, is that in all these places, the relationship between fear and danger is starkly disproportionate. Thus, in Cape Town, the homicide ratio in 2013 between the wealthier white suburbs and poor black townships was 0 to 262. 2/3 of all murder victims are black males between 20 and 39. Yet it is in the wealthy white suburbs that the argot and the angst about violence is the most marked. Thus, too, elsewhere in the US, where despite the claims of the New York Police Department to the contrary, violent crime is at the lowest in a generation. Those who discuss the threat of lawlessness and social disorder in such overheated terms rarely suffer it directly. This is not to deny that criminality is a gravely serious matter in many places, but so is chronic unemployment, poverty, disease, ecological and technological disaster, regional wars, xenophobic attacks. Yet these seldom elicit the same kind of civic outrage, severe penal sanction, or urgent policy mongering, except, of course, the threat of terror, which is understood as the kind of ultimate global law-breaking. Not only is it that criminality is commonly perceived to be on the rise, thus to justify the popular punitiveness that has gripped much of the late modern world, vide the punitive politics of the Trump regime, The phenomenon itself as a category of signifying practice appears to be changing. States are now said to be governing through crime, indeed to have become penal states in the global north and criminal states in the global south. They are also said to be managing populations with reference to it, to be deploying it to achieve the effects of civil war in some places, and to use it as justification for digitalizing entire nations under its biometric sign. Reciprocally, as the language of criminality becomes the vernacular in which politics is increasingly conducted, governments delegitimize their opponents in that name, and are themselves indicted by citizens for corruption, war atrocities, human rights abuses, and violations and seizures of property. What is more, those citizens tend increasingly to construe social reality in toto in a kind of dialectical dance with the mass media and the culture industry through the allegory of lawmaking and lawbreaking. As this implies, criminality serves not merely as an index of moral meltdown and simmering disorder, it is also the object of political demand, an alibi for assertive efforts to remake the authority of the law. Now, of course, this counterpart between fear, the fear of lawlessness, and a need to recover order is not peculiar to the present. As a kind of secular resurrection narrative, it has been an enduring feature of modern state-making. But it seems to be a particularly urgent motif in public discourse at present. Listen to the cri de coeur from the New York Police Department in 2014. The city is lurching backwards to the bad old days of high crime, danger, infested public spaces where families worried about their safety. In spite of this, there's been a significant decline of violent crime in that city. The problem then will be plain enough. While global felony rates may or may not have escalated, some say they have, others disagree, the preoccupation with lawlessness appears to have reached epidemic proportions. It expresses itself in rising prison rates, calls for tougher enforcement and longer sentences, draconian strategies of social management, and an explosive economy of representation that makes capital from it. As this suggests, crime is a key metaphysical optic by means of which people across the world understand and act upon their worlds today. But why? Why should this be so if the risk posed by lawlessness appears disproportionate to its incidence? After all, crime waves, real and imagined, have occurred in many times in the past. Classically, they signal transformations, and industrializing Europe, for instance, think of Foucault's Discipline and Punish, but also recent transitions to democracy in Latin America and elsewhere. Could it be that with the end of the long 20th century, this preoccupation makes evident dystopic disjunctures within the so-called new global order, indexing a kind of tectonic shift in the relationship between capital, governance, and the state? Could it be that the shift, made manifest in the refiguration of the nation-state form and its rapid privatization, also its corporate capture, think here Trump or Zuma, is recasting the line between the political and the illegal, and blurring the distinction between the criminal economy and legitimate business? Could it be that this, by turn, is having an effect in many places on practices of sovereignty, on public perceptions of social disorder, and on the ways in which populations are being defined, differentiated, managed, even commodified, all the more so as inequality appears to be reaching ever greater proportions, in which finally crime is being mobilized to frame new philosophical concerns, new forms of truth, and new species of normative knowledge about an increasingly agitated world. In order to address these questions, we propose in the longer version, from which this is a very short summary, and all the ethnography, alas, is left out, we propose a criminal anthropology of late modern global times, one that seeks to plumb the meaning of criminality so as to interrogate the larger, more or less visible conditions that spawn the phenomenologies of fear and the metaphysics of disorder in which they are embedded. If the truth about crime lies in its capacity to yield truths about the times in which we live, the heightened preoccupation with it points to a number of hard late modern realities that speak to an epoch under construction, realities captured in contrasting ways by our opening fragments. Read together, these 4 fragments illuminate the contours of a shift, which we mentioned just a moment ago, a shift that is in the relationship between capital estate and governance that is changing both the meaning of criminality and, we would argue, the nature of policing. So the first 2 fragments that concern these brutal attacks on young people in the US and the UK give evidence of the redrawing of the line between crime and politics, and by extension, between the legal and its transgression. In point of fact, that line has always been porous and partisan. Sovereign power resides precisely in the capacity to enforce it, to draw the line. In the late modern world, as the line becomes ever more murky, the effort to withdraw it, to redraw it, to make and suspend the law, and thus to delegitimate dissent and difference, inequality and inequity, has become the defining act of statecraft. In the process, protest and poverty are often treated as the unfortunate product of irrational choice, delinquent behavior, or moral culpability. People across America, says Sarah Stillman, although she could have been talking about many other places as well, are routinely jailed for such things as fees and fines and debts that they are too poor to pay. Held captive for their own immiseration, they are also incarcerated for many other petty offenses associated with life in the lumpen undersides of the civil society. Thus are social and structural effects erased from the language of lawmaking and lawbreaking. Thus concomitantly, does criminology displace sociology as the social science that deals with, or more precisely disciplines knowledge practices concerning disorder at its most general, and in many places, the UK being one of them, the number of students enrolling in criminology programs is now greater than those enrolling in sociology programs. These first 2 fragments speak about the obtrusive presence of the state in law enforcement. Even more, the rising kind of militarization of the police, a global phenomenon that moves the war on crime and violence from the metaphorical, in many places, to the literal. By striking contrast, the 3rd and 4th fragments, those that concern the privatization of the response to crime, stress the opposite, the apparent absence of the state, its withdrawal from its subject citizens, and the devolution of policing functions into the commercial sector. This, the hyperpresence of the state and its palpable absence in terms of everyday enforcement, may appear paradoxical, but it's not. Quite the contrary, it is a critical node in the ongoing transformation of crime and policing, a byproduct of what Dardo and Laval call the new way of the world. For our purposes here, we are less concerned in characterizing that order in theory than to focus on one of its signature manifestations, the transformation of the nation-state itself, and in particular, the way this is affecting changes in the nature of crime and policing. So we have already alluded to several elements involved in that metamorphosis. Each of them is relatively well recognized and well documented. The ideological ascendance of the market as the productive epicenter of material and social value. The impetus to reduce government to an ensemble of institutions designed to secure, license, and promote the frictionless workings of a more or less deregulated economy. And the displacement of many state functions into the private sector, or so-called public-private collaborations. To these should be added, because we can't discuss them here, the rise of new species of property, but also, as Tanya mentioned, transformations in the nature of labor, and I would argue its disempowerment. From these elements follow 3 consequences, each of them, again, widely documented. The first is the dispersal of state sovereignty, occurring increasingly, if unevenly, across the world. Specifically, its appropriation by transnational business firms, NGOs, theocracies, ethnopolities, organized crime, civilized associations, and civic associations, and security conglomerates, all of which seek to control semi-enclaved terrains and the lives and sometimes deaths of those who fall under their sway. Typically, too, these authorities erect facsimiles of criminal justice systems and administrative bureaucracies. They adopt the rhetorics and rituals of citizenship in order to make real their rule. Some even enact constitutions. These lateral sovereignties may be more or less complete and more or less tolerated by ruling regimes. The second effect of the morphing state form is the transformation of the ecology of citizenship. We encounter this in talk of responsibilization. We heard a lot about this today, which places the onus on the private subject for his own self-care. And for the pursuing of the rationalization of his own life in cost-benefit, her own life in cost-benefit calculations. Accompanying this transformation is the replacement of the idea of society with such concrete abstractions as the public, the community, and most of all, the network, a kind of globally, digitally mediated phantasm constituted of self-producing subjects. Yeah. The subjects whose rights and interests, even within the family, and sometimes even in utero, are imminently ranged against one another. Thus does, and it was mentioned earlier, Homo economicus infuse the embodied essence of humanity, an essence made manifest in the equation of freedom as choice. Choice of commodities, identities, moralities, sexualities, religiosities, and concomitantly, the right and duty to optimize those preferences. For present purposes, we focus on just one further dimension of citizenship, the erosion of the social contract mentioned above and the spectre of inequality. The turn of the state away from the business of welfare towards the welfare of business, its reluctance to redistribute, to raise minimum wages, and to regulate labor markets have rendered large numbers of people disposable, bereft of any prospect of steady employment, or if they are employed, with incomes insufficient to support dignified lives. We keep saying that in much of America, you need 2.3, 2.4, depending on where you are, jobs to be able to make a livelihood. Vide the unusually agitated reaction to Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, which tellingly opens with the Marikana massacre, using it as a paradigmatic instance of the distributional problem at the core of contemporary capitalism. Those on the wrong side of this widening wealth gap, and it's been referred to pretty often today and this evening, the so-called precariat, are a growing mass of and underinsured at-risk citizens who in the eyes of authority appears a new kind of dangerous class, even in some places a new criminal type, one might say. They are named and narrated often as an enemy within, against whose condition of being, poverty, disease, non-orthodox families, drug use, homelessness, vagrancy, war is being waged in the name of the law. These are what Donald Trump calls the bad hombres. This legitimizes the outlawing of sometimes whole sectors of the population and enforcing laws that prohibit many to pursue ordinary survival practices. Eric Garner was notoriously killed by police in New York City in 2014 while being arrested for selling loose cigarettes from an unstamped pack, a petty crime against a regressive tax that disproportionately disadvantages the poor. All this points to a politics of mutual mistrust in many places between the state and its citizens, and a sense encountered earlier of the kind of uncivil compact between the empowered and the disempowered. For many of those citizens who believe that the state could protect them, but in fact fails to do so, they see this as a violation, a basic violation of their citizenship. And a lot of this is around the kind of new movements like Black Lives Matter and so on in the US, and similar movements in South Africa and elsewhere. The third corollary of the morphing state form is an especially critical one. It is the ever-growing murkiness in the shadows of the rising global economy, of the line between the licit and the illicit, the entrepreneurial and the extra-legal, and with it, a pervasive sense that crime lurks everywhere, either in plain sight or just beyond. These two things, the murkiness of the line and the pervasive sense of lurking criminality, congeal into what may be characterized as a kind of criminal spectre, a kind of metaphysic of disorder. In large part, the spectre has its source in the processes of uneven liberalization, deregulation, and deterritorialization of the new economy, and the accelerated the accelerated nature of space-time compression, which have greatly enhanced the capacity of capital to keep moving across borders and to pursue legally laxed and relatively untaxed shelters. This, plus the sheer complexity of commercial and administrative legal geographies, has yielded a world hospitable to what is conventionally perceived as corruption and fraud. Both are widely seen to have become endemic, not just to business, but also to government. This in turn is owed directly to the outsourcing of government functions, which in effect have transformed the state into something akin to a holding company, a kind of meta-corporation under the sign of Nationality, Inc., which often operates as a licensing authority. That is, in the game of franchising out social, security, carceral, administrative, and other services to profit-seeking firms. The corruption laced seamlessly in the fabric of the state is better described then as a kind of rentier governance, being a systematic feature of contemporary political economy. It is, we stress, both a corollary and a manifestation of this criminal spectre we were talking about, of the blurring of the received distinctions between conventional business practices and organized crime, of brokerage and bribery, of speculation and venture capital and Ponzi-style skullduggery, all of which are viewed in the US finance industry as merely distasteful cousins to the high-rolling world of securities, thereby muddying the difference between criminal and everyday investment practices. Perhaps the most striking feature of the criminal spectre is the inseparability much of the time of crime from policing. This has both epic and mundane dimensions. In the USA, for instance, according to Human Rights Watch, the FBI, in the course of setting up sting operations aimed at catching criminals and terrorists, has actually created them out of law-abiding citizens. This is not new, of course. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI regularly violated the law. But the practice seems to have expanded exponentially, according to recent studies, and occurs at all levels of policing. A recent head of Interpol, the world's most senior cop, Jackie Salibi, who happened also to be South Africa's police commissioner, was imprisoned in 2010 for 15 years for illicit dealings with a notorious drug pin. Salibi, who'd been a major activist in the anti-apartheid movement, died in 2015. Despite his criminal past, he was eulogized by the regime and given a national funeral. None of this is unexpected in a world in which law-breaking and law enforcement are so entangled as often impossible to set apart. This entanglement has also laid the ground for mutual accusations of criminal malfeasance, especially corruption. And this has become a conventional instrument, the kind of hatchet of choice in struggles among the rich and powerful, vide the recent presidential election. She should be locked up. He won't show us his tax returns. And also, if you think about battles over the recent Brazilian presidency. More mundanely, in both South Africa and the USA, felony rates among cops appear strikingly high. In South Africa, fully 10% of the police force faced criminal charges in 2000, a figure likely to be surpassed in 2017. Notwithstanding the fact that many are perfectly honest and more or less competent, it is often unclear who are really cops, who are crooked ones, who are fakes, who are employees of commercial companies. All the more so since the real ones are poorly paid and hence thought perpetually open to the seductions of the criminal economy. So in conclusion then, these elemental shifts in the state form in its relationship to capital and to crime and policing make plain why it is that lawlessness is presumed almost everywhere to be on the rise, everywhere heating up, as it were. This patently is the succubus in the shadows of the rising global economy. The very undecidability of the lines between the licit and the illicit, between lawmaking and lawbreaking, and law enforcement, presents itself phenomenologically as a kind of imminent disorder, whether or not statistically fear and risk are proportionate, or disproportionate, whether or not criminal violence is actually on the rise. This, in turn, underscores the transcendent significance of crime as a kind of lingua franca, a kind of ethno-sociological idiom in which to debate, dissect, and diagnose the truth about social order itself, and to reflect on the quality of life, and to confront by indirection critical questions about governance and politics, about race and class and gender, even identity and civility, and much else besides. Crime and punishment cuts across all genres of representation, fact-finding, fiction, fantasy, serving as an allegory, as affective and aesthetic dialect. To a greater extent than ever before, it is a global register in which societies think about themselves and think aloud. Recall once more Durkheim's stress on the semiotic side of crime, and as an instrument of divination almost, by means of which publics produce and posit knowledge about themselves. But functionalist fantasy fails where it becomes ever less possible to draw a definitive line and a sustained line between law and lawlessness. Thus the lament on that South African website and others like it, that the social contract has been abrogated and that as a result, the self-imagining of a community, of the cohesion born of collective consciousness and unity of purpose has somehow been voided. And that civil society, absent of reliable means of truth, has lost its moorings. Absent that truth, the question of who and what it is that might serve as a sovereign guarantor of safety, security, and moral order presents itself ever more urgently. For large swathes of national populations, this question is left perpetually open, perpetually the object of an anxious uncertainty. Hence also, we might argue, the recent rise of authoritarian populism. Hence to the fantasy that if it did have the will, the state could recapture both its monopoly over the means of legitimate coercion and its patrimonial role in the protection of its citizens. Popular desire for security runs constantly up against fear and distrust, which in turn yields a kind of pathological public sphere, something that Mark Seltzer has written about in the US. It was precisely this, in this pathological public sphere, that a metaphysics of disorder has taken root against much of the geosphere. This counterpoint of desire and distrust, of the im/possibility of the police function, and of the undecidability of crime and policing, of the murky spectral spaces of the illicit, we would argue, in the age of fractured sovereignty, the age where the authority of the law, its auratic authority, if you like, is compromised by the devolution of so much of its operations into, and the functions of the state into the market and various other kinds of forces. This brings us back finally to where we began, to the truth about crime. Its meaning, whatever its incidence and its consequences, cannot simply be reduced to a kind of sociology of pathology. Beyond being a system of meaningful signs, it is also a lived vernacular through which social life is apprehended, contested, and acted upon, and through which politics and publics, economy and society are made and are being remade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Well, thank you very much, Jean Komarov. I think everybody here will agree that we've been treated to a second splendid lecture this evening. If I'm better prepared with my comments this time, it's only because I had a glass of wine in the interval. I am less well prepared in terms of my academic background, so I can make only the briefest of connections with my discipline, with professional concerns of anthropology, and then I'll just offer a few echoes, really of a journalistic kind, from what I hear. Perhaps I'll begin with the journalism, because I live in Germany, and in the last couple of years, there has been a lot of anguished discussion. Many people would say it is indeed a pathological public sphere these days, above all because of the migration crisis. Most people call it that. They don't use the word refugee as often as they use the word migrant. And the media are so important in this. Of course, this is banal, but I can't help thinking about it almost every morning on the local radio station. If there is a news item about a right-wing populist attack on an asylum home for refugees, it will be countered by a report maybe a quarter of an hour later, or maybe in the very same news bulletin. There is another study confirming that criminality has increased in the areas where the migrants are concentrated, and it's very often criminality of a cultural kind, where in particular German women need to be so extra careful these days not to go out on the streets. You know these stories. I'm sure it gets into the media here as well. But for me, when Jean talks about law, crime, policing, these were not topics primarily researched in the set of projects of overheating, but this idea of crime as I think you called it metaphysical optic. Yes, it's a metaphysical optic, and it's one that hits me almost every day in the German media when the focus is on citizenship, migration. But of course, crime is not limited to this sector of society. These new developments at all, the movement of people forced and unforced, voluntary. Crime has been a big story in Germany in the last couple of years at the other end of society, in particular in the Volkswagen Corporation, the diesel emission scandals. And the cause here is of obviously radically different nature. The bonuses that the Volkswagen management executives, that everybody in that company above a certain level, the common employees, Volkswagen gives almost all of its employees an unusually high degree of security. Germany generally enjoys a high reputation. It's declining over the years, but it's still high compared to most of its neighbors. But just look at the abuses in the highest echelons of German management, its most prestigious company. I'm going to be provocative now because I've had that glass of wine. Is it so different in Norway? Much smaller country, very, in many respects, privileged economic situation because you have that invisible hydrocarbon resources. I read on the BBC homepage, I think it was this morning, but my memory's getting fuzzy, the temperature is still rising and I'm feeling fuzzy at this time of the day, but I think I read that Norwegian Air is going to be pioneering cheap transatlantic flights. Very soon you'll be able to fly to North America just as you fly to Stockholm and to Copenhagen. It's going to cost less than $100, and it's possible because the technologies are changing, lighter airplanes. Norwegian Air was there at the beginning, buying up those lighter planes and already flying to a number of some of the less prestigious destinations. But it's going to grow. This market is going to grow. My prediction will be this is yet another sector where the incentives, even to chief executives who have their own moral compass and would unambiguously condemn what the Volkswagen executives have done over the last decade, but they will be sucked into the same system where it is their job to maximize shareholder value, to maximize the bonuses for the people with whom they work on a day-to-day basis, so that the criminality, I'm suggesting, is built into that capitalist economy that Jean also touched upon several times in her lecture. Those are the connections that I make when I connect her lecture with the news items that hit me on a daily basis, living in Germany, reading the BBC for much of my information. But let me try and give another connection to Norway. Actually, this one is to Denmark, but perhaps you're close enough. You will tell me afterwards, informally, whether there is any echo in this society. I have a good anthropologist friend in Copenhagen called Stephen Sampson, an American, so he has a certain distance to Denmark, even though he's lived there for most of his life. One of his recent interests, and I think it's developed into a full-scale project, he's writing about this at the moment, and I hope I don't misrepresent anything, but because he's officially retired from his job at Lund, he has the time to take a closer interest in apparently mundane activities in his neighborhood, in the capital city of Copenhagen. What's he looking at that connects with Jean's topic? He's looking at the state and crime and public attitudes, morality, reporting of crime. And the ideas, I'm not sure whether they've been implemented across the city or in just particular parts of Copenhagen, or perhaps not at all yet. Perhaps it's all at the level of debate right now. But the idea is, because to keep our kind of Scandinavian social democracy going, taxation is absolutely crucial for the redistribution that the state makes possible. And if you have very high rates of taxation that make it incredibly attractive to someone who has networks in Eastern Europe and can bring in Romanian gypsies to do all the domestic work that you need doing around your properties, rather than pay honest domestic Danish entrepreneurs to do that and pay the taxes, then of course you will do so. What is the moral obligation on the neighbor across your garden fence if the neighbor observes this activity going on? Should there be a hotline at the local town hall for the neighbor to report the strong suspicion that neighbor has been employing black labor? And this is surely criminal. And what does the state do in those circumstances? What kind of moralities, when we are talking about crime in society? I can't help thinking, because of our speaker this evening, there is a Manchester pedigree here as well. Eric Hobsbawm developed the concept of the social bandit with reference to totally different ethnographic historical materials, but the question of when crime can actually be viewed rather positively, at least by some sections of the society. Anthropologists have also written quite powerful studies. I'm thinking of Ray Abrahams, but I'm sure there are many others, of vigilantes. And vigilantes can be rather nasty people who lynch people they suspect of. The crime might be witchcraft rather than the theft of property, but they might be merged in popular moral compasses. Vigilantes might be rather benign forms of local association to protect neighborhoods, very popular in many suburban areas of Britain. That's where Ray Abrahams first got interested in that topic in the 1980s, connected his anthropology in a British city, Cambridge, with ethnographic materials from East Africa, where he worked as an anthropologist. So you can bring together very different kinds of ethnographic materials to explore these themes. Jean Komaroff gave us an absolutely fascinating exploration of them. And I think the best I can do in closing my brief remarks, because he's in my mind this evening following the earlier talks, I would like to just encourage us to think a little bit more about citizenship, a term that you used several times, about belonging to communities, societies. Durkheim's key term, but society was also the key term of Karl Polanyi, of course. Human collectivities that need to regulate life in the community if it is to flourish. I'm using human flourishing in a very general sense here. Once again, Johann Gottfried is a source of inspiration. And one quotation that I think I have fairly deeply embedded in my mind, partly perhaps from that conference here 15 years ago, whenever it was. Herder has a sentence where he seems to make fun of the cosmopolitans. He says something like, "Those who embrace the entire universe with love, for the most part, love nothing but their narrow selves." That's Johann Gottfried Herder. Last October, in my native country, I still have only a British passport, but I'm thinking seriously, I might have to get another one quite soon. Last October, my Prime Minister, Theresa May, at a party conference, Conservative Party conference, seemed to be echoing Herder, although the commentaries at the time did not pick up the connection. She said something like, "Those who claim to be citizens of the entire world are the citizens of nowhere." And she had some negative comments for that statement, of course, because so many stateless people around the world. But the idea that Theresa May is appealing to, she's of course trying to pick up some of the UKIP vote when she says things like that. She wants English people who care about the English flag, English values, the English landscape, the uniqueness of England. She wants to associate all of that with her party and win the next election. But the deeper questions of reconciling citizenship, universal values, human rights, with those questions about identifying with particular places, communities, Herder is, of course, the man for emphasizing local rootedness. Herder is absolutely opposed to slavery. That's unambiguous in his writings. Slavery is an evil thing. The colonial nations of France and England are doing it. The Germans were not doing it at the time, so it was natural for him to condemn slavery unambiguously. I don't think he would have much sympathy for the kind of pressures that force so many sub-Saharan Africans to migrate as they do. It may not be slavery any longer, but the basic moral disgust would be there in Herder in exactly the same way. But Herder does not solve that deeper question, which for me, Jean Komaroff's lecture tonight was raising, this question about how to reconcile those universal ideals, the Weltbürger, to go back to the Kantian term which Herder was tangling with. He was tangling with another German, Kant, as well as with the French contemporaries. How do we reconcile that with an anthropological respect and commitment to particular places, societies, cultures, nations? Herder used those terms more or less synonymously. That's enough for me, I think, at this point. Thank you very much.
A couple of these questions first.
Yes, great. So, good.
Okay, so maybe I'll just say a couple of things in response. Thank you. Those were very provocative comments and right on the mark in many ways. One of the things that interests me particularly about being here, and somebody just told me in the break that in fact there's been debate in Norway about raising sentences for crimes to higher levels and so on. This not correlating maybe with rising crime rates directly. One of the things that's most fascinating about the phenomenon that we're writing about here is that because it's about perceptions as much as anything else, it's about ways of trying to understand order and to make sense of what seems to be ground shifting beneath one's feet. We spent a lot of time looking not only at the popular press, as you were noting, and of course there, the yellow press has loved crime forever, but the degree to which and how it is that the particular diagnostics are figured and how they reflect, the politics of the moment, and indeed exactly the same thing goes on in the US. We now have, in fact, a bureau for particular crimes that are committed by immigrants, and indeed attacks upon women and intimate crimes are high up there. There's not much evidence that they've happened yet. But the thing that interests me much about Scandinavia is the rise of crime writing here. The fact that people like Henning Mankell, for instance, and I left something out of this paper, which is that Henning Mankell is talking about Sweden, and we have the sentence, in sedate Sweden, where it seems as if crime couldn't be more different than, say, in the US or the UK. He writes about the country as kind of obsessed with this threat of crime and the inability of the criminal justice system to deliver, and you have the whole rise of Nordic noir, right? You have Stieg Larsson, you have Joe Nesbo, you have the whole kind of world watching this extraordinary crime fiction that is such an interesting diagnostic about things other than crime in the literal sense, that talk about what it is to be a nation, how you close borders, how you can have forms of justice with high rates of difference. And the whole issue of how it is that crime fiction has changed in its nature proportionately across the world, because you have crime noir emerging as a kind of new dark form of fiction about crime, which is not about resolving the issues. It's not about solving the mystery. It's often about the undecidability and the fact that the best criminal is the best detective was himself a criminal, right? And the degree to which this is, we now have we have tartan noir in Scotland, we have, and across the world we have this rise of a kind of picaresque, would-be almost social bandit figure, so that, for instance, crime shows in the US increasingly make the criminal himself, not simply the person that's put down in classic Durkheimian form. He may rise and be highly exciting and attractive, but in the end the law triumphs, and this is why crime fiction is always seen to be about the functional return of social order in the modernist sense. But these days you have people like Tony Soprano, or Breaking Bad, and these people have become the kind of philosopher rogue outlaws of the society. And they talk about all kinds of things, including the normalization and suburbanization of crime. And Tony Soprano has brought psychoanalysis back into mainstream television, and is somebody whom, and we say this in our book, has taken the place of the death of the salesman in the high modernist period, who would have spoken for America and its values and the impossibility and the impossibility. Now you have this kind of world where it's undecidable, and we don't know how we feel about this man, because he's also a father, and he has a house in New Jersey, and he takes his child to university, and so what I'm saying is that there is a way in which the expansion of crime, and you think about it here in Scandinavia, and the degree to which, and you'll have to tell me whether it does or doesn't actually correlate with what appear to be rising criminology figures, you know, sort of the sense that people feel threatened in their homes, or where there's something else going on here about the global circulation of this genre, and why it is that it's this idiom increasing. It's taken over the great tradition of South African novel writing now, and it all is now. And it's about a sense that we've lost the plot, in a way, you know, in this kind of post-colonial, and we're trying to put it back again. But it comes back in crime fiction. But to come back to the point you made, it's the social bandit form, and it's a form that many people point out was there in early modern Europe, before the state was consolidating, and there was an undecidability about the sovereignty of the law. And it's emerged again now, or we would argue, as sovereignty is again dispersed in some ways, where the law and right and the ability to draw that line is not so clear. And it's a way of thinking about all these other dimensions. So it is once and the same time a longing for a return of a kind of order that maybe we never had, when we could draw the line between law and lawlessness. But it's also a very realistic, very political way of talking about all kinds of other things, and the undecidability, as you were saying, between the ethics of enterprise or an open world or a reasonable national identity and the commitment to these other kinds of pressures under which we live. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Well, a very rich paper. The floor is now open for questions. I also just have a brief comment myself, because I thought it was a very, goes back to some of my research, and also the role of new media in the transferal of these violent imaginaries and the securitization of difference. Because if you look at populist parties, you see very often how they exploit critical events, very often associated with actual crime committed by migrants. So, for instance, the crime committed in Köln is being rapidly trans-evaluated and exploited. A lecture by Viktor Orban last weekend said, we want to hear the sound of children and not the sound of ambulances and sirens, exploiting the Manchester terror attack. So it's also something about the spectacle of violence. We see murders being streamed on Facebook Live. And there's also the threat and actuality of globalized terror in Europe that's also informing these fears and creating this very gap between perception and the actuality. And also the Swedish dystopia, how Trump invokes that. I've been to Molenbeek, I've been to Malmö. There's certain places that also are associated with these violent hotspots. So just a comment.
Yeah. And what's interesting about what you're saying is that some of them are very graphic and very explicit, and mobilized obviously around cultures of fear that have a very long genealogy and roll into the particular circumstances of the present. But there's also what somebody called Jaime Lopez, who's a law professor in America, calls dog whistle kind of communication, which is you don't actually say that this is about Manchester and violence and that this is what's going to happen here, but you flash the signs, right? And those signs and these become a kind of litany of references that gather significance, and again, they translocal in really interesting ways, right? And I think this is important in what you're saying.
Questions? Pardon? Well, then I invite Thomas and Tanya up to the stage. Yes, we can have also the closing session.
Can I sit somewhere where I'm not looking directly into the light?
Get your sunglasses.
Great.
Okay.
Yes.
And you can sit in the middle of the Katrina.
Oh, the light. Yeah. I'm sorry about this, but do we have to have these lights?
Thomas got his hat on. It's a good solution.
I can't see the audience. It's really hard to communicate.
So perhaps I was wondering, Jean, I was going to ask a question anyway, so if I can, may I? About you said the blurred boundary. You talked about there are lots of blurred boundaries, a lot of destabilization going on these days, which creates anxiety, and which may go a long way to explain the popularity of crime writing in this part of the world. notwithstanding the fact that crime rates are down, in spite, although anxiety around crime is up. Yes, the same kind of thing that you were talking about. But all right, so the boundary between legit business and white-collar criminality, basically, is being blurred. But what I think is even perhaps more concerning is the fact that the boundary between politics and business is being blurred. I mean, the Norwegian Prime Minister was just in China on an official visit, the first in several years, because there had been a cold front between Norway and China because of the Nobel Prize to a Chinese dissident. And the Chinese human rights activist said that, well, she seems to have morphed into some kind of fishmonger, you know, because Norway is keen to sell as much salmon as possible. There was no mention of human rights, no mention of freedom of expression. The Minister of Culture was there as well, just recently, and she said she didn't see it as her task to discuss the freedom of expression. And if the Minister of Culture doesn't see that as her task, who should? So in other words, that boundary is being blurred. I've seen this to a great extent in my work in Australia as well, the way in which it's hard to tell where business ends and politics begin. You know, because they're on each other's boards. The big resource companies managed to bring an elected prime minister down, Kevin Rudd, because he had proposed a carbon tax. So in other words, you see what I mean? That also makes politics trickier and less manageable than it may have been in the past.
Look, it's always been that way. To some degree, right? Particularly in places like the US, where in fact, you know, even before the passing of the recent legislation that took all limits off campaign financing, it was always the case that, you know, the wealthy people got into politics. But there was some sense, you know, of at least a notional line. You know, most people, for instance, renounced, as Mr. Trump has not done. You know, they got off the boards, they recused themselves, they disconnected themselves for the time that they were in office from the direct investments in business. But Mr. Trump has turned America into his own personal brand. He's branded the nation, basically. And he continues quite shamelessly, in almost Carl Schmittian fashion, to break all the laws that ostensibly are about the separation of those kinds of powers. Yes. I mean, you know, you have his personal aide on television advertising his daughter's clothing line, and people find that, you know, sort of, in a sense, refreshing in some quarters and horrifying in others. But in fact, it's dissolved more and more. I don't think it wasn't the case that the business and politics work, and they always were. You know. But there were these forms of hedging and distantiation. There were the kind of moral boundaries in terms of a certain displacement for the time that one was directly in office. And these have eroded completely. Because in fact, what's good for business is now what's good for the nation, in that sense. I mean, you are in fact the vendor of, you know,
yes, exactly.
So this makes the whole thing extraordinarily difficult, and it makes it quite hard to know how one finds a politics, because after the politics of outrage has been expressed, one then has to find something that's much more tangible by way of some form of leverage. And usually we turn in some ways to the law. But finding the justiciable basis for this, as we've found in the US, is also not so easy, right? Because in fact those bastions have fallen so directly. So, I mean, your Minister of Culture may be a fishmonger, but at least she's selling national wares. Trump is selling his own line, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Can I say something? Yeah. He's putting his alias on Washington, basically.
I just want to suggest cautiously, perhaps the Norwegian Minister of Culture has read Herder, because there are plenty of passages in Herder where you would learn to show restraint when you travel to foreign lands to tell other people about, well, human rights didn't exist, but Herder did have an ideal of humanität, and he might have some sympathy with Chinese leaders who, accepting that actually it's always been like that, and money could buy you power in the United States, it's just that we had this fiction of separating powers and transparency, and it is all a fiction, as we now see so clearly in the age of Trump. So who are we to go to China and preach moral values? I should stress, I am not particularly sympathetic to the present power holders in Beijing. I wanted to do a month's field work in a remote part of China next month. I am refused permission. It is a very repressive place. I would not like to live there, but I do not think that we in Western Europe are in a position to take a strong moral line on these
matters.
So on this particular nexus that Thomas has raised.
Yeah, I mean, you know, America accuses Africa of having kleptocracies. Yeah?
Yeah. There you go.
I rest my case.
On the most important issue facing this planet, which is a major dimension of the overheating research, China is with Europe and against Donald Trump. That is the new alliance. There is a unity across Eurasia against the world's hegemonic power. Concerning the Paris Accords, I mean.
One question that came to my mind listening to you, Jean, was the sort of, I'm going to kind of echo my earlier talk, but the generality of this, because I think it's, you mentioned law as the last resort. Can you actually impeach Trump? That's to say, will the law kick in? And to me, that's a really interesting and differentiated political question. There are environments in which you might think of the law as such a resource, or it may actually function in that way, and other places in which that would be a completely futile gesture. You would not think of going to law to deal with power. So I think it's sort of an interesting empirical question, like in what contexts does law stand outside this kind of, or is it imagined to stand outside and be an arbiter of this kind of political thuggery and so on, or is it understood to be laced through it through and through? So, in Indonesia, the law is called the mafia system. It's actually called the Judicial Mafia, and it's understood to be part and parcel of a generally mafiosi style of government, and no one would go to the law to arbitrate or to bring outside. But in other contexts, I think that really does happen, right? So I'm just throwing it out there that are we all criminals now, or is it actually worth differentiating the forms and domains in which?
I think I don't think we're talking first of all about whether we are criminals or not. I mean, we're saying that what is regarded as criminal and not, is first of all shifting dramatically, and is always, a matter of history and who calls the question. The big question now is what is criminal in this kind of world and who calls it. But I think, with due respect, many people have pointed out that there is a judicialization of politics. With the shifting, if you like, nature of the nation state and its sovereignty, there's a move away from former democratic political or national political fora into the law in many, many places. Right? And even where, in fact, people are cynical about the law. The famous statement that John always cites, for my friends, justice, for my enemies, the law, right? But it's a game we all play. I mean, take it the situation of lawfare that we've been writing about that's going on in Brazil, where the Dilma, the ruling head of state, is removed by people who themselves are being indicted for. So it's a question of who calls the question and with plausibility. So, so the resort to law, where once before, in former times, we would resort to political forums of an elected nature, is widespread. And it's helped by global institutions, not only of civil litigation, but in fact of, indigenous rights, all the things we were talking about today. Legal NGOs are all over the planet, and they're undermining the sovereignty of states in many places, sometimes for the good and sometimes not. But I think we have to acknowledge that there are structures, if not simply, not simplistic determinations. There are structures and there are family resemblances across the world that we cannot ignore. We know these things. We don't have to go and find out. These are things that I think we already have a lot of accumulated information about. The question is who has access to the law and who doesn't. And do these solutions, sometimes called Lilliputian, where smaller populations more distanced from the power of access to the law, can we help them use the law in ways that are useful? And does the law always help them, or do you need to have the law in collaboration with social movements, with other kinds of media interventions and so on? But I think it's a pretty widespread phenomenon.
I think, again, securitization is integral to authoritarian nationalism, and one defining feature of authoritarian nationalism is also this focus on biosocial purity and rootedness of identities. And I think also why Trump has been so successful is that he actually also addresses the Herderian longing for that territorialized identity, which many people find so precarious. And also because he addresses crime committed by immigrants. So he takes up the victims of violence, highlighting their stories, about the Mexican rapist, about the Syrian refugee and so forth, and using this very language in order to differentiate between those who belong and those who don't belong. And so actually addressing the real concerns and fears people have about rapid change on their identity and belonging.
Yeah, and rending the idiom of crime, and a very simple idea of perpetrator and victim, with a clarity that doesn't exist in the world in terms of the criminal justice system maybe, but taking what are large-scale structural problems, which by the way is where I think our anthropological impact has to come. We have to be able to explain how, and this is the beauty of the project that you're engaged in, how the various examples that you're looking at in careful, grounded complexity are also part of family resemblances across the world that we cannot ignore. And we have to try and explain those things in ways that make sense to people, rather than saying simply it's more complicated or it's very different. We have to provide something that is a counter to the simple authoritarian usages of nationalism, of crime and punishment, which reduces these complex issues to a question of the kind of the zero sum of the law.
Yes, and in this sense, to return to some of the more general questions that I think we should try to finish with what you say, Katrina. In this sense, there is something about trying to be a comparativist, trying to be a comparative anthropologist in this day and age, which places us in a rather privileged position as opposed to previous generations when things were far more disjointed and dislocated and without any real sort of interaction or networking because of global communication, which means that the people that we're working with, of course it's true as Tanya points out, that yes, there are people who don't have a climate change discourse. In Gladstone, Queensland, they don't really have a climate change discourse. They see that as something the cappuccino sipping classes are wasting the time with in Sydney and Melbourne. Because they're too busy producing, coal and shipping it to China and Japan. So, but still, we are all exposed to comparable discourses and comparable worldviews. So when you talk about incarceration, as you do, Jean, South Africa and the United States are not really representative because they have very high rates of incarceration in both of these countries. And yet, what you say resonates with peaceful, benign Norway, with very low rates of incarceration, where there is hysteria around crimigrants and about crime committed by immigrants. Although crime has been regular crime has been decreasing for several years in spite of the growth in the number of immigrants. So in other words, many of these discourses are shared. So that one of the things we did while we were doing fieldwork, for example, all of a sudden Nelson Mandela died. And I immediately typed out a message. You remember that. How did people respond where you are? Because I could assume that people in the Philippines, in Sierra Leone, in Peru, many had a notion about who Nelson Mandela was, and they would have some kind of response. We never use this for anything, but it's just an example of a way in which we can do comparative anthropology now in ways which were formerly not possible. Also because people are aware of each other. I met with, and I got to know rather well, an environmental activist in Gladstone, Queensland, who had become a convert to environmentalism as a mature woman. She'd been a housewife and a businesswoman. And in her mid-50s, she saw the dolphins starting to die, the crabs contracting diseases. She saw all the lies that were being put to them by the scientists, brought up by the Port Corporation and by the Port Corporation itself and by local politicians. And before I finished my fieldwork, she had started to read up on the tar sands in Alberta, making connections and seeing the similarities. And all of a sudden, raising, as it were, her environmental consciousness from the beach where she'd seen those dead fish to begin with, to the Great Barrier Reef and to global climate change and to the connections between extractive industries in Australia and in Canada and global capitalism. And that's quite a jump. It's quite a sort of a cognitive achievement, which is possible in this day and age, and which makes these endeavors so interesting.
Well, think about the discourse about AIDS in Africa, for instance, right?
Yes.
And the degree to which, as Didier Fassin says, the bodies spoke, right? And people try to make sense of them, or GM seeds. Yeah. People around the world who are kind of barely online, right, are watching what GM seeds do from year to year, and they're beginning to understand what this is about, and they're connecting them. And so you have a kind of upscaling. This idea of rescaling is something that's done in vernacular contexts all the time. And through the very, the use of people make of cell phones, and they use media in ways that we don't in the West because we have the luxury of much more. The way in which cell phones in Africa have created whole new worlds, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And not least for refugees coming to Europe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I know we have to close soon, but I want to throw in a slight, it's not quite dissent, but at least reservations concerning what I hear to be transnational civil society. That wasn't quite the way you phrased it, but these connections are extremely important. From the Hungarian village that I study, everybody, not everybody, most people now have access to the social media, and they use the social media, and that played an important role in the stereotyping of these migrants and Hungarian nationalism. Yes, but I'm not sure that anthropologists highlighting the activist organizations that promote the dominant viewpoint of the New York Times is going to be enough in our lifetimes to counter all of those readers of newspapers like The Sun and the Daily Mail and even the Times, the pro-Brexit, the populist papers, and they have their Hungarian equivalents, of course. So I'm afraid I have to come back to Hera once again. I don't think Hera would subscribe to global civil society. And his critique of the ideal of the Weltbürger in the 18th century, he would apply it to the globe-trotting superstars of Western academia today, if that is the only line they take. It is not the only line in the overheating projects. I have understood all along the local commitment is there. It is documented in these projects. So I think overheating strikes that ideal balance between the universalist ideals of humanität, but it's rooted. Most people around the world are not moving around the way we do. Their jobs are threatened. Trump is popular. Trump got elected not just because he threw the crime stereotypes into his speeches. He also, even more frequently, just mentioned jobs, protecting people's livelihoods in the United States. This has echoes which Karl Polanyi would have understood, which Hera would have understood. And we have to understand, call it fear if you like, but it's not our livelihoods that are on the line through this neoliberal marketization of everything on the planet. It's this which anthropologists also can make a contribution to countering, in my view. So we've got to have that balance between the cosmopolitan and the locally rooted.
But you know, the paradox, Chris, is that I agree with that and appreciate your comments. But the paradox is that the Herderian narrative also travels. So localisms tend to resemble each other. Nativism resembles the nativism in Hungary resembles the one in England. And they must have learned from each other.
And they meet at conferences.
You don't think so?
They're super international, yes.
The Hungarians have a very rich repertoire of Central Asian shamanism, which I haven't yet come across in UKIP.
Boy, could we deal with that. Yeah.
Yes. So I think we should have a round of applause for our distinguished guests. Yes.
So, thanks everybody for spending this day and evening with us. It's been wonderful and great to see so many people here. And on that note, maybe Katrina, you would like to say good night?
Yes, good night everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a stimulating, evening and day. It's been a long day, so thank you all for your stamina and patience. Thank you.